Welcome back. Let's see if we can discover a new theorem. Okay, so taking a look at our given, the measure of angle A is 100 degrees. So let's go ahead and mark that on there. Okay, that angle, 100 degrees. Then it says that A is sup to B. Well, if A is sup to B, but A is 100, how are we going to find out angle B? We're going to subtract. So we're going to say 180 minus 100, and I'm left with 80. So that means that angle B is now 80 degrees. Okay, fine. So the goal, remember, keep your eyes on the prize here. The goal is to find angle C. So now I know that B and C are sup. So if these guys are sup and this one's 80, well, again, we can subtract and say 180. That's what it means to be supplementary. They add to 180. 180 minus 80, that leaves me with angle C is 100. So the measure of angle C is 100 degrees. Okay, what are we seeing here? Here's what you should be seeing. A was 100 and C comes out to 100. That's not a fluke that they are the same. Okay, if two angles, and by two angles I mean A and C, if two angles are sup to the same angle, then they have to be congruent. There's no other way for the math to work. So again, without the diagram this time, let's just focus in right here. Okay, if two angles, and by two angles I mean A and C, if they are sup to the same exact angle, then they have to be congruent. Okay, and there's our theorem. If two angles are sup to the same angle, then they are congruent. Okay, let's step up our game one notch. So same initial given, measure of angle A is 100 degrees. This time I'm telling you B and C are congruent, so I've marked them congruent. I've given you two sup statements, and our goal, here I marked in green, is to find the measure of angle D. All right, so let's go through this. If A and B are supplementary, so here's A, here's B, if they're supplementary, subtracting, that means that angle B is now going to be 80 degrees. Well, if angle B is 80 degrees, then that makes angle C 80 degrees, because they're congruent. Okay, if those are both 80 degrees, but then it tells me that C and D are sup, that means that D is 100 degrees. Okay, so what did we discover this time? We discovered if two angles are sup to not the same angle, like the last slide, but congruent angles, then they are also congruent. So what does that mean? That means since A and D are supplementary to B and C, remember they were marked congruent, then that makes A and D congruent. So if I try to color code this, all right, these guys are sup to these guys, and because these guys are congruent, that makes the blue ones, or angles A and D, also congruent. Okay, last thing, I just want to note that the last two theorems we discovered also hold for complementary. So maybe you want to make yourself an example and check and see that it also holds for complementary. Okay, it could be if two angles are comp to congruent angles, then they're also congruent. If two angles are comp to the same angle, then they're also congruent.